A monarchy projecting absolute stability through foreign conquest and a sprawling royal family is often just masking the architecture of its own collapse. When the English crown spent a century bleeding its resources into the fields of France, it inadvertently built a domestic machine designed for civil slaughter. To understand the systemic failure known as the Wars of the Roses, we must examine how the very mechanisms meant to secure the throne ultimately dismantled it. The rot began with a fatal miscalculation by Edward III. He believed that distributing immense territorial wealth and creating powerful duchies for his 5 surviving sons would anchor the crown's authority. Instead, this structural legacy birthed rival dynasties armed with royal blood and unchecked resources. This wealth fueled a catastrophic transition into an era of bastard feudalism. Loyalty ceased to be a sacred oath to the sovereign, becoming a financial transaction that bound massive private retinues to regional lords, effectively eclipsing the crown's monopoly on violence. The 100 Years' War accelerated this disintegration. Far from just a foreign conflict, it was the engine of England's internal ruin, militarizing the nobility, draining the treasury, and leaving a generation of warlords searching for new battlefields at home. The authority of the Lancastrian regime was built on the victories of Henry V. By the 1440s, that foundation had disintegrated. The final collapse of English holdings in France, culminating in the loss of Normandy in 1450 and Gascony in 1453, was not just a military defeat, but a catastrophic failure of statecraft. The crown lost immense prestige and, critically, vast streams of revenue. Unemployed soldiers and dispossessed nobles returned to an England bankrupted by the war, creating a volatile class of men with military experience and deep-seated grievances against the government. This failure fractured the English court into 2 irreconcilable factions: a peace party led by the Duke of Somerset and the formidable Queen Margaret of Anjou coalesced around the pliable King Henry VI, advocating for cutting losses. Opposing them was a war party whose figurehead became Richard, Duke of York. York represented the powerful magnates who had lost continental estates and viewed the peace as a betrayal of their interests. The Somerset faction didn't just outmaneuver York politically, they neutralized him. In 1447, he was stripped of his command in France and appointed to govern Ireland, a clear political exile designed to remove a rival power center. The system was no longer about national policy, but about which faction could monopolize control over the weak king. Then, in August 1453, the entire political calculus shattered. Upon hearing news of the final, humiliating loss of Bordeaux, Henry VI suffered a complete mental breakdown, rendering him an unresponsive catatonic. The throne was not empty, but the king was no longer there. This power vacuum was absolute. With the king a political non-entity, the question was no longer who could influence the monarch, but who would seize control of the state itself. York returned from Ireland to fill the void, leveraging alliances to have himself named Lord Protector in 1454, and promptly arresting Somerset. But when Henry VI unexpectedly recovered late that year, Queen Margaret's faction immediately reversed York's appointments. The political mechanism for resolving disputes was broken. For York and his allies, submitting now meant political annihilation. Force was the only remaining option. When York raised an army in May 1455, his objective was not yet the throne. It was the final removal of his rival, the Duke of Somerset. The two forces met at St. Albans, but this was intended as a last, armed negotiation. York demanded Somerset be handed over for trial. King Henry, shielded by his Lancastrian loyalists, refused. With all political channels exhausted, the only remaining instrument was violence. The First Battle of St. Albans was not a battle for England. It was the bloody collapse of a political argument. The fighting itself was less a pitched battle and more a targeted purge. After being stalled at the town's barricades, York's ally, the Earl of Warwick, executed a flanking maneuver through unguarded gardens, breaking into the marketplace. The ensuing chaos was brutally efficient. Somerset was cornered and cut down, along with other key Lancastrian nobles. York had physically eliminated his rivals and captured the king, once again making himself protector. But this brutal solution solved nothing. Queen Margaret, now the undisputed leader of the Lancastrian cause, was not party to this settlement. After another Yorkist victory at Northampton in 1460, a desperate parliament attempted to legislate a solution. The Act of Accord was a political monstrosity. Henry VI would remain king, but Richard of York, not Henry's own son, would be his heir. This attempt to institutionalize the crisis was a legal fiction that pleased no one. It legitimized York's ambition while formally disinheriting the Prince of Wales, guaranteeing Margaret would fight for her son's birthright. And she did. Raising a formidable army in the north, Margaret rendered the Act of Accord meaningless. In December 1460, York marched to his own strategic doom. Underestimating Lancastrian strength, he was cornered and besieged by a vastly superior force at Sandal Castle. In a move of staggering arrogance or fatal miscalculation, York chose to sally out and fight in the open field. The result was an annihilation. The Yorkist army was destroyed, and Richard of York himself was killed. His head, mockingly adorned with a paper crown, was impaled on the gates of York. The Act of Accord was now a dead letter, and its intended beneficiary was a decapitated corpse. The conflict was no longer about who would control the king. It was now a war of succession, a blood feud for the throne itself. With Richard of York dead, leadership of the Yorkist faction fell to his 18-year-old son, Edward. While the Lancastrians won a subsequent victory at the Second Battle of St Albans and recaptured Henry VI, they failed to secure London. Edward seized the political vacuum, entering the capital to popular support and proclaiming himself King Edward IV in March 1461. This act made a decisive military confrontation inevitable. The armies met on Palm Sunday near the village of Towton amidst a blinding snowstorm. The battle that followed was not one of chivalric glory, but of industrial-scale slaughter, becoming the bloodiest ever fought on English soil. The tactical pivot was the wind. Yorkist archers, with the wind at their backs, loosed volleys that found their mark. The Lancastrians, blinded by snow and shooting into the gale, saw their arrows fall short. Goaded into a downhill charge, they entered a grueling, hours-long melee. The battle hung in the balance until the late arrival of the Duke of Norfolk's fresh troops, which smashed into the Lancastrian flank. The line broke, and the retreat turned into a massacre, with estimates of over 28,000 dead. Edward's throne was secured by blood, but the peace was immediately undermined by political friction. His key supporter, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker, had expected to be the true power behind the crown. Instead, Edward asserted his own authority. In 1464, he secretly married Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner widow, while Warwick was in France negotiating a prestigious royal match for the king. The marriage was a public humiliation for Warwick and elevated the Woodville family, creating a rival court faction. Edward then compounded the insult by forging an alliance with Burgundy, directly contradicting Warwick's pro-French policy. The kingmaker, sidelined and enraged, turned from ally to conspirator. In 1469, he instigated a rebellion, even drawing Edward's own brother, the Duke of Clarence, to his side. After an initial failure, Warwick fled to France, where he made an unthinkable alliance with his old nemesis, Margaret of Anjou. Backed by French funds, Warwick invaded England in September 1470. Edward's support crumbled, forcing him into exile. The senile Henry VI was retrieved from the Tower and placed back on the throne. The Yorkist ascendancy had collapsed into betrayal, proving that even a decisive victory like Towton could not stabilize a system built on personal ambition. Warwick's restoration of Henry VI was a strategic house of cards. Edward IV returned from exile in March 1471, landing with a small force but gathering support as he marched south. He outmaneuvered Warwick, entered London, and retook custody of Henry VI. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Barnet. In a thick morning fog, the armies misaligned. The battle turned on a fatal error. The Earl of Oxford's banner was mistaken for Edward's, and his returning troops were fired upon by their own Lancastrian allies. Cries of treason shattered their line. Warwick the Kingmaker was killed fleeing the field. On that same day, Margaret of Anjou landed in England with her son, the Lancastrian heir. Edward intercepted their army at Tewkesbury in May. The battle was a tactical masterclass for the Yorkists, but its strategic importance was absolute. Prince Edward was killed, extinguishing the direct Lancastrian line. Henry VI was quietly executed in the Tower days later, ending the war's second phase. Edward IV's reign brought over a decade of relative stability, but his death in 1483 reopened the crisis. His brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was named Lord Protector for the 12-year-old King Edward V. Richard acted with brutal efficiency. He arrested the Queen's Woodville relatives, confined the young king and his brother to the Tower of London, and then had Parliament declare them illegitimate. With the princes in the Tower effectively removed, he seized the throne for himself as Richard III. This usurpation was a fatal miscalculation, alienating Yorkist loyalists and creating a new coalition of opposition around the last Lancastrian claimant, Henry Tudor. The final act came at Bosworth Field in August 1485. The battle was not a clash of titans, but a pragmatic execution. Richard's army was numerically superior, but a key contingent under the Stanley family remained neutral, waiting to see which way the wind blew. Seeing Henry Tudor's banner exposed, Richard launched a desperate cavalry charge to kill his rival personally. As he closed in, the Stanleys finally committed their forces against Richard. The king was unhorsed, surrounded, and killed. The death of the monarch on the battlefield, not ideology, provided the final resolution, ending the Plantagenet dynasty and the wars. Bosworth's verdict was tested almost immediately by the Yorkist rebellions of 1486 and 1487. These desperate efforts, culminating at the Battle of Stoke Field, proved futile. Lacking a credible claimant, the final Yorkist gasp was extinguished, cementing the Tudor consolidation of power. This resolution was transformative. The war had served as a brutal crucible, burning away the decentralized system of bastard feudalism that fueled the conflict. In its place, a more centralized, bureaucratic state emerged, fundamentally altering the English monarchy and ending the era of the overmighty subject. History teaches us, if we listen,